Now, one of the other things that you're going to notice, now that we've got this back in some semblance of an order, and all three of these have had floats applied to them, and we have this gap here, is you can see that that's white. Now remember, when we didn't have any floats applied to box 3, 2, or 1, and so let's go actually clear those floats so that they go into the normal flow, there's our kind of pinkish background that we have. That's the main. So if we go to main, and it says we have this background color that's this kind of pinky salmon color, it disappears in these areas where it's all floated. So if I go back to box 1 and add that float back in, so I'll just float it right again, notice this turns white. Well, what's happening here is what's referred to as a collapse of the parent. Let's think about what that means. So I have this graphic that nicely illustrates what is happening. If this little outline is the parent, so that would be main, and I'll explain what a parent is in just a moment. But say this is our main in our example, and this would be box 1, 2, 3, and in this case there'd be a box 4 floated, which means then the height of this all but pretty much collapses or disappears because none of the elements are following the normal flow of HTML. So in order to fix that, there are some different things that we can do. But let's first talk about what a parent is. So I'm going to go back to the code. So here we are in our code. Using that example, what's happening is this main is collapsing. It is the parent because it contains each of these elements. So box 1, box 2, and box 3 can be considered its children. And some of how we know that is if we come down, if you're in Dreamweaver, that gives us a nice little peek at this. We're clicked on box 3, the div for box 3, so that's what's highlighted here, and this gives us the structure of how it works up through the site. So div class box 3 is a child of main, and main technically is a child of body because main is contained within the body. So just as this H1 in our header would be a child of header, these divs for our boxes are the children and main is the parent. So that's what's happening if we go out here. We can't see it, but main is there. It's just collapsed, and we know it's there because it says so in the code. If we were to give main a height, we would actually see it is there. See, I've given it a height of 100 pixels. It is here, but there's still this white because these boxes go beyond what that parent is because they have all had floats applied to them. So I'm going to remove this height. We don't need it. One of the things that we can do is we can give that parent a float. So I'm going to go into main. Main does not have a float, but by giving it one, and I'm just going to float it left. It doesn't have a width, but it's now reclaimed this space and is containing those boxes. So if I give it also a width, and I'm just going to say 100%. We're going to claim that whole thing. Now you can see how this spreads out and we have that pinkish background. So it has reclaimed that space. So I have given it a width of 100 and I've floated this. So that's one way that we can tackle this. Another, and this we actually do need to go into the code. So I'm getting rid of that float and that width. And I'm going to go back to our code. If we go in here and we create within the main, we're going to create a blank div, because remember, a div is just an empty box. And I'm going to give it an inline style of clear both. Remember I said this is empty, so it opens and it closes, and there's nothing in between it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we're going to go back out to the browser. Okay, so we're back out on the browser, and we can see we have this pink background, because what we've done is now with main, we have added this little div that says clear both. But because that div exists there and it's part of the natural flow, and the reason it's part of the natural flow is we're saying clear those floats that are above it. And because it's empty, we don't actually see it. we could go in here and give it some text. Actually, I think I need to go back to the code to do that. That's one of the things. So we could actually say, just to show that it's here, this is the div. I'm going to save it. And now we're back here in the browser, and here's where that little div is, where we typed in the text, and it says this is the div. So it was there, it existed, but because we said clear, it means forget about this, everything that says float left and right, and go back into the normal flow of things. So that's one way that we can do this. I'm going to go back into our code and we're going to remove that because I want to show you another way. So that's one way that you can clear it if you're having that problem, clear that collapse. The other is a method called overflow. Okay, here we are back. I got rid of that little div. It's no longer down here. And so now this is white again because our main parent has collapsed. So what we can do is go into the main style. So I'm just going to do that right out here, and it's called overflow. Now there are some options in overflow. There's auto and inherit, and we're going to ignore those because auto pretty much, or default, it just does the default setting. Inherit is kind of the same thing. It picks up what was ever defined before that. But then there's visible, scroll, and hidden. And what happens when you do visible is it can tend to overlap the overflow, and the text overwrites each other and the boxes overwrite each other, and we don't like that. So we're not going to do that. Scroll inserts some scroll bars. So it'll contain it within that width, but it'll give you scroll bars so you can see it. That's a little annoying, but it can be useful depending on your situation. The one we're going to do is called hidden. And what hidden basically says is overflow that area and reclaims that space, but it doesn't necessarily overwrite that text. So notice I put in the word hidden and our main is back. So it's right there. This overflow hidden method, one caution, it wasn't designed specifically to clear floats, but it's become one that's really commonly used. But occasionally you might run into some issues with it. For the most part, this is the one that I tend to use. It's what a lot of web designers and developers use. There is another one out there called ClearFix, and we're not going to go into that. It kind of goes beyond the scope of what we're covering in this class. However, if you're interested in using it, by all means go out to W3 Schools, take a look, and play around with it. The other fix, so if overflow hidden doesn't quite work, or adding the float left or float right of our main with a width applied to it, if that's one method. Another method, of course, is this overflow hidden, and the other method is to add that additional empty div tag that says clear. So then on that